Hey, Untold Radio Network fans. Want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Good evening, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and this week marks the incredibly tragic 56th anniversary of the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which spanned Point Pleasant and on the West Virginia town, and it went across the Ohio River to the Ohio side. And when that bridge collapsed, I think something like 46 people passed. It was just before Christmas, so you can only imagine the devastation to the town. But it's probably best remembered, at least in the paranormal and the Fortean community, because of the writings of Gray Barker and the writings of John Keel, who kind of, I guess, hedged the tragedy as the denouement, perhaps, or the climax of the Mothman mystery, that now elusive cryptid, which is probably almost as famous in cryptozoology and in Fortean lore as any other creature, perhaps except maybe Bigfoot. But were those two incidents really connected? Did somehow Mothman cause that bridge to collapse? Was he an omen of the collapse? Were the people in the town conscious that these two things had something to do with each other? And how did the people of the town get over both those kind of incredibly strange events, one an incredible tragedy and one a haunting by an eerie creature from beyond? Anyway, tonight's guests are probably going to help us get closer to that answer. They're the authors of Bridging the Tragedy, a book based upon the 1967 Silver Bridge disaster in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, Mothman, and post-traumatic growth, a phenomenon that often occurs after tragedy. His interest in the paranormal began in the late 70s with the original Project UFO television series. I used to watch that myself. It was kind of vaguely based on Project Blue Book, so much fun. In 2003, he was introduced to the Mothman Prophecies movie, and it changed his life. He holds a doctorate in psychology with a focus on post-traumatic growth. The good things which come from bad experiences is basically what post-traumatic growth means. His wife and research and writing partner is a retired USPS Postmaster and a current business owner-operator. She specializes in research, data analytics, and connecting the dots between intuition, perception, and reality. Since 2016, the couple have visited Point Pleasant regularly, where they have become friends with several area residents, including Mothman Museum owner Jeff Wamsley and the late Carolin Harris, co-founder of the Mothman Museum. So I'm delighted to introduce Bill and Jaci Kousoulas.
Good evening, Dean.
It's so wonderful to have you both here. And thank you so much for coming on this week as well, because it's such a, I suppose, significant time, particularly for the history that's looked at in your book, this anniversary.
It really is, and I guess it didn't occur to me how close we are to the anniversary of the Silver Bridge disaster until the last couple of days, when it just dawned on me. I was very much wanting to go to Point Pleasant for the 15th, for the ceremony that they hold at the river every year. But the holidays are upon us. We have way too much going on, and we just can't get away right now.
No, I imagine. I've never even been there. I've been I suppose, impacted by Keel's Mothman prophecies, since they found it in a rather bizarre string of incidents themselves with a weird tragedy, in which I won't go into tonight because I could talk about that for an hour. But when I read that book in gosh, I don't know, back in the mid-90s, it forever changed my life. I was already interested in the UFO phenomenon, but I think Keel's book and the tragedy in that book, and particularly the way that Keel talks about the unexplained, made me realize that one could look at the UFO phenomenon and look at this kind of material without instantly having to jump to either a completely skeptical or to a completely nuts and bolts, it's extraterrestrial or flesh and blood, they're, real creatures living in the woods. So it opened up the vistas, I think, of what the paranormal research and historical research about the paranormal could be for me. But maybe before we go into talking about your book and talking about Point Pleasant and Mothman and the Silver Bridge, maybe you could both tell our audience a little bit what got you interested in this type of phenomena.
Sure, absolutely. I can start, Dean. I mean, really, as you mentioned, the Project UFO TV show is what really kind of kicked off my interest, that there were things that we didn't really understand that were going on in the world and in the universe around us. When that TV show came on, I was about 9 years old, and I would race home. I think it was on Sunday nights, and just begin watching the program, just riveted to the TV because it was just a fascinating show. I didn't know what aliens were. I didn't know what UFOs were, but I sure wanted to know more about them. And even before that, my mom used to read The Hobbit to me when I was 7 or 8 years old. So that was my introduction to fantasy. So those two things together got me started.
And Jackie, what about you? Yeah.
I grew up in a rural area, and we had different types of I guess it's called high strangeness now, things that would happen. And my very first paranormal experience that I can remember, I was so tiny that I don't even know, I must have been 3 or 4 years old, and woke up in the middle of the night with my siblings, went to our bedroom doors, and Jesus was standing at the end of the hallway, an apparition of Jesus. And it just kept getting weirder and weirder as life went on. And as far as, I literally think that me and my cousins and siblings saw what might have been either a Darrow or Bigfoot. Don't know, because we were small kids, and of course no adult would go outside and check out what we were talking about. But so I've always had interest in anything paranormal and UFO type activities, alien kind of stuff. I've seen UFOs, I've seen orbs, I've seen all kinds of really weird things. So Bill introduced me to Mothman. I don't believe that I ever saw the Mothman prophecy before I met him, but he introduced me. We went to Point Pleasant, and I've been fascinated by all of it, and really fascinated with John Keel and his work.
Now, Jackie, before we move it to Keel and Mothman, I'm going to have to follow up on your Darrow encounter, because when I read it in the book, my jaw dropped. I'm currently in the middle of making a documentary about Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver and the Shaver mystery, called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. And it's rare these days to hear somebody come forward and say that they have had an encounter with the Darrow.
Well, like I said, I was a kid, so I don't know that that's what it was, but we were outside playing ball on the west side of our house, where we always played balls when we were kids. And we had a field to the west, and there was kind of a slight hill on that field. And we looked off. I don't know why we looked off that direction, but we looked off in that direction, and we saw this big squared off looking figure, lumbering up over this hill, and it just kept coming at us and coming at us. And the thing looked huge to us. And that was our encounter. We ran in the house and told our moms, because they were in the house playing cards, and they told us to go back out and play. And we're like, we're not going back out there. And we never did. We wouldn't go back out the rest of the day. It scared the heck out of us. So I think maybe possibly a Darrow in my mind, because of the way it moved. And it didn't look like hairy or anything. It looked like squared off. So that's why I say Darrow.
Had you heard of Darrow then, or is that something later that you discovered?
I was small. That's something after I heard about the Shaver mystery that I literally thought that It could have been a Darrow. It really could have been a Darrow.
Fantastic. That's just incredible. I love it. I so rarely hear anybody with any Darrow stories these days. Now, maybe we can begin, because now I guess we'll move into to Point Pleasant and the Mothman and the like. What were your experiences when you first went there and let people know that you were conducting the research that you were? In fact, maybe you guys can talk a little bit about the research project first, and then we can segue into how you were received in Point Pleasant when you went there with those kind of goals and intentions.
Well, Dean, we had the good fortune, I think, of visiting Point Pleasant numerous times before we really even settled on coming up with the project. We knew that we wanted to write a book that had something to do with Mothman, something to do with Point Pleasant, probably as far back as 2015, 2016. But we didn't take our first trip there until 2016. And on that very first trip, we had the good fortune to meet Jeff, who runs the Mothman Museum, is just a wonderful ambassador for the Point Pleasant community and the whole Mothman legend in general. And he's just a true gentleman. He's just a great guy. But we also met a lady by the name of Carolin Harris. And Carolin used to own and operate the Harris's Steakhouse really right across the street from the Mothman Museum. And when we first arrived in Point Pleasant in July of 2016, we got to town late. And it was late in the day. I mean, for us, it was late. It was after 5. Point Pleasant's a small town. Everything was shut down. We went to the Mothman statue. We looked in the windows at the Mothman Museum. And then I was ready to pack it in and go find out what else there was really maybe to do in town. But Jackie said, there's a little lady in that restaurant over there, and she wants to talk to us. And I said, yeah, well, let's just walk on down the street here. And she said, no, she wants to talk to us. And in my wife's way of putting things, that means this is what we're going to do. So we walked into this little restaurant, and this little older lady invited us in, and we started visiting with her. And it turns out she was Carolin Harris, and she had been in 16 or 17 Mothman and Point Pleasant documentaries. So I had seen her on TV. She looked kind of familiar, but when I asked her if I'd seen her, and she said, yeah, I've been in all kinds of documentaries, she just was wonderful. She really introduced us to the town. Not that she took us out, but she was the first person we met in town. And visiting with her just totally set the tone for the whole experience. And that was our very first trip. And after our first trip, we were in town for about 5 days, and we stopped at her restaurant every day and just visited and had a nice time with her. We met another guy by the name of Mark Griffith, who you'll probably recognize that name because you read the book. He's our first interviewee. But we went back home, back into our regular daily lives, and a few months later decided that we were going to contact Carolin because we had learned that she had lost her son in the Silver Bridge disaster. And that was something that was very poignant. It was very powerful, and it really drew us close to her. We wanted to know her better, respectfully. But Christmas Eve, I told Jackie I wanted to call Carolin. Jackie said, why don't you wait till after the holidays? Christmas Day, Mark got a hold of us, told us that Carolin had had a heart attack. And the next day, Carolin passed away.
Oh,
so
geez, I'm sorry.
We only knew her for a week, but she was like a family member to us. And that was the beginning of our introduction to Point Pleasant, and why it became very important to us to write a book about her experience in a limited fashion, but really the greater community and how they reacted to the Silver Bridge disaster, the Mothman mystery, and what's happened in the community since then.
Yeah, it's the way you handle the people you witness is very sensitive, I find, which is great. I mean, you're conscious that the bridge disaster was such a tragedy, and then I think you're also conscious, which I was unaware of, that people in Point Pleasant apparently don't really like to talk about the bridge disaster and Mothman in the same breath. Like they're happy to talk about them separately, but they don't like to attach Mothman to the collapse of the Silver Bridge the way perhaps that we're used to from the writings of John Keel and Gray Barker and almost everybody since then.
I would agree. And we tried to approach the research with a very careful way of dealing with the people there that had dealt with the bridge disaster. And really it was because that disaster was so central to the identity of the community those people lost loved ones, and it was a very real, tangible disaster. And for people who are not aware, Point Pleasant is only about 6,000 people in that town, and the greater area, maybe 15,000 people in the entire 2-county area spanning the Ohio River. And the way it was described to us was that if you didn't know somebody who died on the bridge, you knew somebody who died on the bridge. So when we devised our research questions, we were very careful to separate them. And we started out with a series of, we wanted to know what the dimensions of post-traumatic growth were for the community, for the people who experienced the Silver Bridge disaster. And then for people who were interested in talking about the paranormal phenomena, what was their experience of the paranormal phenomena? Because again, we wanted to learn what dimension of post-traumatic growth they may have experienced by going through that phenomena as well too. So we really focused on keeping them as separate topics. Anybody who wanted to bridge the gap and talk about them being coincidental or somewhat related was perfectly acceptable, because this was their experience, not ours. We were just the instruments in the study.
Are you the first person who's looked at post-traumatic growth in relation to paranormal events, or has this been looked at before?
I am not aware of anybody else who has utilized that particular concept. I think it's very valuable research. I think it's important.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth? Maybe I think most people might be able to kind of work out what it means, but maybe you can give a more, precise definition.
So, we all know what trauma is. And to some degree, most of us, if not all of us, have experienced some level of trauma. Trauma is the bad stuff that happens to us in life. It's basically what changes us, the things that really challenge our worldview. The idea that the world is safe and that only good things are going to happen to me is a wonderful idea to have, but most of us don't get out of this life without some adversity, right? So the idea, and this is something that's been investigated for maybe 25, 30 years, is the way that people not only get through trauma, but if processed in a positive fashion with the best supporting elements, that you can not only get through trauma, but you can almost use it as a springboard to get to levels in life that you maybe never really dreamed even would be possible. So post-traumatic growth is the experience of going through adversity and thriving as a result of going through that adversity.
And maybe just what were a few examples of some of the people you interviewed who were conscious that through your questioning, that through the trauma they'd been through, either with the collapse or with experiences with the paranormal surrounding the whole Mothman incident, where they'd seen that they'd grown? Because it's quite clear in the book. It's very clear that these people have made that growth, but maybe for those who haven't read the book, you could talk about a couple of them.
So there were 11 people that we interviewed. And the first one that comes to mind for me is Jimmy Wedge. Jimmy Wedge was the oldest person who we interviewed for the study. And I got to tell you, when he called me to respond to the ad that we had placed in the local newspaper, I was floored. This Southern gentleman called me up and he said, "Hey, I read y'all's advertisement for a study you're looking to do about the bridge disaster, and I'm interested." So we just started visiting, and he said, "I lost both my mom and dad in the Silver Bridge disaster." And I felt that. I thought, this is going to be a very powerful interview. This is going to be a little intimidating, to be perfectly honest with you, that we're going to interview a gentleman who lost his mom and his dad both in the bridge disaster. What we didn't know was that Jimmy Wedge is pretty legendary in West Virginia. He's a big deal, and we had no idea, going into the study, who he was. Jeff Wamsley, who runs the Mothman Museum, and Denny Bellamy, who's been in self-acclaimed over 60 documentaries about Point Pleasant. Both of them, their jaws dropped when they found out that Denny volunteered. They said, "You got the man. He is the man you would want for this interview." And he's a big deal. He's a politician. He's a lobbyist. He's been in Congress. He's really important in this area. So by then, I'm looking at Jackie and I'm thinking maybe we better have you interview him because she's a retired government official. And I thought maybe they'd connect better. But, we took a deep breath and we interviewed Jimmy, and he was the most fun interview of anybody that we talked to. Denny was a blast too. And we had some wonderful conversations. But Jimmy was just a cut up. I mean, he was hilarious. But the things that he talked about in losing mom and dad, he said he gained a little sense of cockiness. He said, because now, I knew I had to do life on my own. I didn't have mom and dad. I learned to be more resourceful. He was very resilient. He really thrived as a result of going through the loss of both mom and dad. And he was 25 when it happened. I didn't realize that until we interviewed him, that he was as old as he was when it happened. He told us how grateful he was that he wasn't 15. He said, because for a younger person, that would have been just devastating. But he said, for me, not that I'd ever want to lose my mom and dad at any age, but I'm grateful I had them as long as I did.
That was actually my favorite interview in the book as well, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but Jimmy Wedge is also the individual who supposedly dressed as the bird in the TNT area and may be at the heart of the Mothman legend itself.
Yeah.
That was Jimmy.
That was Jimmy. And what did he tell us about that segment of the interview and in terms of a bunch of other spots in the interview?
Off the record.
Yeah. But then he joked with us after he said this is off the record, and he says, well, the statute of limitations is over anyway.
The time frame didn't quite line up though, so we were okay with that because he did that as an older teenager, and when the bridge collapsed, he was 25 years old. So we didn't believe him.
It's a funny story. You know what? There's already been a spectacular movie. I'm a big fan of the Mothman Prophecies, as I know, the film as well as the book, obviously, as I know you both are as well. But imagine a film which has the high comedy of Jimmy Wedge dressed as the bird and going down Lover's Lane and pranking teenagers making out. And then when the bridge collapses, he loses his parents on it. And then later he's the mayor of Point Pleasant. Like, the story is almost like you almost couldn't invent this story.
Nobody's put it together that way. That's the first time I've heard anybody describe that, but you're absolutely right. I didn't even think about that.
It's an incredible narrative. I mean, I have a background as a screenwriter as well, so I think often like that. And I'm looking at it and going, this would be the most incredible film. Yeah. Like, you almost can't, the beats are so perfect.
Well, I want to be Jimmy when you do your film.
You're too old.
Oh, yeah. I'm not 25 anymore. You're right about that.
Maybe you can play the older Jimmy.
I'm sorry. Can I add one of the people that we interviewed? The one I was thinking of was Andy Colvin. Andy was a Mothman experiencer. He had witnessed what he thought was Mothman a couple times during his childhood. And from that age on, he had developed some type of a psychic ability and artistic talent that was off the charts, and he doesn't remember having these gifts before. He doesn't remember being artistic, and he doesn't remember having like a extremely high IQ. He had grown so much in intellect that he didn't have to even participate in class. They would let him sit and draw or whatever, paint. I think it was drawings that he was doing, because they knew that he was going to ace the class, even though he wasn't paying attention, because he had just become so intelligent. And then also Harriet Plumbrook lived in the same area that Andy did, and she was an experiencer also, but of the UFO phenomena, and she had missing time, and she became incredibly psychic after that. And Andy took his gifts and became, he's the Mothman photographer. He's done all kinds he's the one that's made most of the keel works available for people now on Amazon. And Harriet took her psychic gifts and became a hypnotherapist, and has treated many, many people. And some, she said, that have shared under hypnosis abduction experiences that they're not even aware of. So those are huge in my mind.
Yeah, I'll be honest. Colvin's interview was probably my second favorite, as was that. What was her name? Colvin's friend. You just said it. She slipped my mind again.
Harriet Plumbrook.
Also a fascinating interview. But what I found so interesting, I'm sure you guys were very conscious of it, as much as almost the entire book is interesting from the opening sentence to the close, is the different ways, not just that perhaps these people were touched by their experiences, but how they read or experienced it entirely differently. Like Jimmy Wedge's version of what happened is this very down to earth, political player and, this resourceful kind of very physical, obvious physical, I mean, in this physical realm, not so much in these other kind of supernatural paranormal worlds that we're talking about as well tonight. While Andy Colvin's is about, government conspiracies and, having the third eye to see creatures and turning into golden, Zabruda, what are they called? Garuda boys and things like. It's just one is just this far, out there psychic kind of version of it. And the other one is just a very down to earth. And I noticed that throughout them, but I think those were two of the most contrasting of just two different extremes of looking at this. So it must have been quite a trip dealing with people who approached this whole thing very differently.
It was interesting to see different reactions, because right off the bat, I think that, we interviewed Mark very first, and he flat out told us he didn't believe that Mothman existed. But when he talked about being a new kid in Point Pleasant and some lady telling him that there's this big bird that's going to get you, and he looked fearful. I mean, he was like, what the heck you going to go tell a kid something like that for? You're going to scare him half to death. And it's like, and I think that's partly why he didn't want to believe it to be true. And then you have Susan Sayer, who broke out in tears several times during the interview, just because it was such an emotional thing. And she still, she wears it as a badge that her dad was part of all of that, and that their family, recognizes or honors, I guess, the memory of the people that have passed. So, yeah.
No, I think your whole book honors the memory of the people who've passed and what the people who survived it have had to go through. We have a question here from Horace Smith, who's a regular listener. He's also been a guest on Talking Weird. He's the emeritus professor of astronomy and physics at Michigan State University. And he asks, do the guests think that those who were older than 25 at the time of the disaster might have responded differently than those who were younger at the time?
I would say absolutely. And I wish we would have had more people that we could have interviewed who would have been older at that time. But Jimmy, being 25 years old at the time of the Silver Bridge disaster, he was 79 when we interviewed him. So everybody else was at least, I think, 7 years his junior. There were a couple of ladies who were 72 when we interviewed them. So he was kind of at the upper end of the people that we had talked to in terms of age. Now, what we've kind of learned through the people who we interviewed and the other people that we've been friends with the last 7 or 8 years of traveling to Point Pleasant is that opinions are totally across the board. I mean, you've got, like Jackie said, Mark Griffith. He didn't believe in Mothman, but Mark was also the guy who, when he took us to the TNT area the first time, and we were looking in one of the igloos, he jumped when some kind of a movement took place inside one of the igloos. So he's professing that he doesn't have any paranormal belief there, but at the same point in time, he's a little spooked by stuff too. So I do think that the older people in the community would have felt differently than the ones who were younger and kind of saw it as more of a legend, or were really excited by the fact. Like, I think it was it Linda or Marva, or maybe, no, it was Charlene. Charlene Westwood talked about how it was really exciting to have all this stuff going on with this Mothman creature, but they were much younger. They were all younger than Jimmy was. I think it's a great question. I wish I had a better answer for the gentleman that asked us.
Yeah, we have another question this one's from Your Successful Life. Could you briefly describe the bridge disaster? That might be a good idea, because we're just assuming everybody's as well versed in it as perhaps we are.
Absolutely. Do you want to take that one, or would you like to
go ahead? You tell stories so well.
I just know I end up talking so much I don't get a chance to let you talk. But yeah, basically the Silver Bridge disaster. So in 1967, there was a bridge that spanned the Ohio River. It connected the Kanawha, Ohio area with Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It was constructed in 1928, and it was known as the Silver Bridge because it was painted like an aluminum color and it shone like silver. But it was constructed in 1928 with horse and buggy in mind and Model T Fords, not 18-wheelers that weighed tons and tons and tons. I want to say there were close to half of 1,000,000 pounds on that bridge when it collapsed. So on December 15th of 1967 at 5:04 p.m., an I-bar, which was part of the construction of the bridge itself, rather than a suspension bridge, it utilized these. They looked almost like spoons, or tongue and groove type pieces of apparatus that supported the bridge. There was a manufacturing defect that had been concealed. You couldn't see where the damage was, but there was a small, I think 32nd of an inch fracture that had been a manufacturing defect that, with all the weight and the elements of the cold and the humidity and just the fact that it was a 39-year-old bridge, that I-bar finally gave way. And when it gave way, the entire bridge went down like a house of cards. In fact, it was described to us that at first the bridge tilted, I think, one direction, and half of the cars that were on the bridge, which was jam-packed in rush hour a week before Christmas, they dumped into the river, and then the bridge tilted the other direction, dumped the other half of the cars off, and then the whole structure fell on top of those poor people and their vehicles below. There were 46 people who died in the disaster. I want to say there were only 7 who made it out of the river, and that's the Silver Bridge disaster.
31 people, 31 cars fell into the river, and it was ice cold conditions. So they said that even if the pieces of the bridge didn't smash them down on top of them, then they would have died from hypothermia. So there were the Christmas presents floating on the river. Someone said they saw a man. Several people told us that they saw a man floating on a semi down the river, and it was very, very sad and tragic. And they talked about the cries and the screaming for help, and then the trying to recover bodies and vehicles and bridge pieces and reconstruct to figure out what happened.
And of course, shortly after that time, with the writings of Barker and Keel, there became the idea that somehow this event was connected to the 13-month or so prior ongoing flap of Mothman sightings in the area. Have either of you come to, maybe who can come to an actual conclusive, theory about this, but is there any way either of you lean into, is there a relationship between the bridge collapse and the Mothman flap, without having to even say what that relationship might be? What's your suspicion?
I would say that just based upon the books and books and books that we've read and the people we've talked to, and not even necessarily the people that we interviewed, but the title of the movie and the title of the book, they're called the Mothman Prophecies for a reason. And that reason is because during those 13 months, not only did we have Men in Black, we had UFOs, we had the Mothman, which was this creature who was silhouetted in black and had piercing red eyes, which never actually physically harmed anybody, but it chased people and terrorized people. I mean, they were horrified by this thing. This went on for 13 months, but also during this time, what I think is what's frequently missed, except by people who are really into the legend and have really studied it, are the prophecies aspect of the Mothman legend. And that is that when John Keel was doing his investigations in Point Pleasant, as well as in his home state, which is New York, on Long Island in particular, there were all types of different things that were happening. He was receiving all kinds of veiled messages from quote unquote informants, which we could call either Men in Black or perhaps alien entities or conspiratorial type people, whatever the deal is. He was getting all kinds of messages that things were going to happen. And this is alluded to in the movie, where you see the character Gordon Smallwood when he is getting these messages from Indrid Cold telling him that 99 people are going to die, Denver 9. And then you see that this has actually happened. And there were other things that happened during the movie which played out like that also. But Keel was receiving all kinds of messages. he received a message that Dr. Martin Luther King was going to be assassinated. We know that happened. He said that Robert Kennedy should avoid airports. Well, he was killed in an airport. And then he also heard that received message that the Pope was going to be assassinated. Well, there was an attempt on the Pope's life, but he thankfully did not die in that attack. But in addition to that, he also was getting information that a disaster was going to happen on the Ohio River. And this is also alluded to in the movie where John Klein, who was Richard Gere playing that character, is going to try to stop the governor of Virginia as he is touring a chemical plant because he thinks the chemical plant is going to explode. Now, this is something that Keel thought, or something along those lines, could happen. But when the bridge collapsed, Keel really blamed himself that he was getting all this disparate information, some of it which was right on, some of it which was not accurate. But he was upset with himself for not being able to put two and two together and realize that it was going to be the bridge that collapsed. I mean, there's no way he could have known that, but he was getting all types of these prophecies. There were people who were having visions of presence floating on the water. And this is something that's a very poignant scene also at the end of the movie, but it's also described in Keel's book where he talks about these visions that people had and then the actual presence from the cars who were going home with their Christmas presents in them. These presents were floating on the Ohio River.
Yeah, that's chilling and probably the most iconic image, I think, when we think about the bridge collapse, that of course it was Christmas and of course there were shoppers, people were seeing these gifts floating on the water, and it's something which comes up in a number of your interviews. And I'll be honest, I think there was a connection too. I'm not sure what the connection was. I often wonder, and I don't think you and Andy Colvin talk about it directly, but I think Colvin mentioned something about the idea of time not necessarily being the linear type time that we think of. And I often have wondered, perhaps a psychic event the size of something like that collapse might send ripples in different directions. You know what I mean? So maybe the collapse itself and that trauma, who knows how, these things interrelate. And I wonder if it somehow, it sounds ridiculous, but that it pushed backwards. Do you know what I mean? That what was coming pushed this kind of, psychic misease or ill-ease and craziness back 13 months. So who knows? But I tend to agree. It seems at least instinctually, and even I suppose putting the writer hat on again, it certainly seems to make sense that there was some kind of, or at least literary sense, that there was some kind of connection. I know you're sensitive too, Jackie, or that you're in tune with those kind of things. Is that something you think as well? Do you see that there's a connection between the collapse and the previous weird occurrences and Mothman and UFOs and everything else that was haunting the Ohio River Valley for the 13 months before?
I think that I don't know if I actually want to say that there was a connection, but somehow I feel that there was a purpose of Mothman, the sightings occurring when they did, and the bridge collapsing when it did, because it was 39 years old. That little fracture in the eye bar had been rusting, and if it hadn't been possibly for that, being so cold and the two stoplights being red on each side of the bridge, maybe it wouldn't have collapsed. But it's very strange that it was 13 months to the day the first sighting of Mothman was reported in Point Pleasant. So
it's uncanny,
for
really.
some reason.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the two red stop signs, because if I recall, the movie uses that, makes a reference to, at least visually, this I suppose the symbology of the red eyes of the Mothman, the red eyes of car brake lights, the red eyes of of stop signs and on the bridge. So this idea that somehow these things are interconnected into some big weirder picture. And I think we often, when I say we, I don't even really consider myself in the paranormal community, but people who are interested in the paranormal, people who are Forteans, we often, and readers of Kill, we often forget that a lot of these terms which have become so well known, whether it's the actual term Mothman or whether it's the idea of ultra-terrestrials or all the type of things Keel wrote about. A lot of this in Keel's writings, he himself said was a type of literary analogy or something. Like he didn't actually mean ultra-terrestrials were necessarily, physical beings from elsewhere, but it was a good way of talking about some type of energy that interacted us and interacted with us and somehow took on these type of things which resembled at least some kind of consciousness. But who knows? But yeah, even when you mentioned then the two red, the stop signs on either end of the bridge, you can't help but think about the Mothman's two red eyes when you hear that. So there's some kind of, maybe it's a coincidence, but again, it's an eerie coincidence.
It is eerie.
When you stand, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
When you stand at the memorial bricks on Main Street of Point Pleasant and turn around and look down 6th Street where Mary Hyer's office was, the stoplights line up perfectly, that when you're standing there and they're red, it looks like two red glowing eyes as well, which
Wow.
I thought was humorous when I took the picture and said I found Mothman, but I don't think it's so funny anymore. It's like giving me goosebumps because there definitely is some type of a connection with the red eyes, the red lights, the whole thing. And I don't want to offend people at Point Pleasant or anywhere, connecting them, because I don't know. But I feel that Mothman had a purpose at that time and place.
We had at least one interviewee who indicated the same thing during our conversation with Susan Sayer. And Susan works for Jeff Wamsley in the Mothman Museum and in a couple of his other stores right there on the main drag in Point Pleasant. But during our conversation and towards the end of it, we had discussed with her that perhaps Mothman came to town really truly to save the town, because once that Silver Bridge collapsed, economic disaster happened in Point Pleasant. That was the main thoroughfare, not just between Ohio and West Virginia, but truly between the East and the West and the North and the South. It was a major, major highway. And when the bridge went down and it was gone for a couple of years, and then when it was built again, the new Silver Memorial Bridge is a couple miles upriver, and all that traffic that used to flow right through downtown Point Pleasant, semis, commuters, getting gasoline, stopping for lunch perhaps, or getting a hotel room for the night, all that commerce was gone. So systematically, you'd see one store after another close, and that town just went down the tubes. When the Mothman Prophecies movie came out in 2002, and Jeff and Carolin started the festival and the museum, at that point, things started kind of rising up again in Point Pleasant. And now we can tell, even in the 8 years we've been going to town, how much different it is on a July night compared to what it was 8 years ago. There was not anybody in town when we arrived that first time. Now there are cars lined up and down the street. Even if the stores are closed, they're walking around taking pictures of their family members with the Mothman statue, going out to the TNT area. That place is really booming now. So we felt that perhaps Mothman came to town to save the town in some ways. I have felt all along, we talked about John Keel, and I'm a Keel aficionado. And I really think the way that he represented Mothman, right at the top of his conjecture about Mothman, was that it was either a Thunderbird or a Garuda, which is basically a protector deity. And in the Native American lore, the Thunderbird sits above humanity and below the gods. It's like an intermediary between the rest. And so if this Mothman creature really was a Thunderbird or a Garuda, or like Keel or Andy say, a transmogrification of energy, or that kind of slips through the veil, so to speak, it didn't hurt anybody. If anything, it was giving all kinds of indications that something bad was going to happen in numerous circumstances. I think, if anything, if there is a connection, it was there to warn. It was there to let people know. And then on the back end, 50 years later, saving the community and their economy.
Yeah, well, it certainly seems to have done that today. I mean, the fact that I think you mention in the book that it's now associated as West Virginia's main kind of tourist emblem or tourist logo is the Mothman, right? That's what people associate with tourism in West Virginia, which is crazy. Like when I first discovered the book, which again was late in the day anyway, it wasn't until I think mid-90s. Nobody knew what Mothman was then. It hadn't penetrated, much beyond a very core group of perhaps Forteans. If you'd said Mothman to anybody, unless they'd read Keel's Mothman Prophecies, people would have looked at you like, what? Is that like a superhero or something? But now you can talk about Mothman like you can talk about Bigfoot almost.
Mm-hmm. I had no idea what Mothman was before the movie. No idea whatsoever.
It's such a wonderful movie. John was really happy with that movie too. I saw the only time I ever spent any time with Keel was at Fort Fest in Maryland in 1999, and the movie was being made. And I remember he both in person and also when he did a speech. So him mentioning how I don't know how much of a kick he got out of the fact that he was going to be played by Richard Gere, because of course Richard Gere is, especially then, he was like the sex symbol, really, right? Like, sure. So Keel thought it was hilarious that they cast Gere to play him, so he got a big thrill out of that. Like, it was like,
but he wanted it to be Brad Pitt.
Oh, is that what he did?
He did, because Brad Pitt was the rising star at that point. I think he thought that Richard Gere was too old by then.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, no, Keel was. I think, yeah, I mean, I suspect somehow Keel impacted both you and I and why we look at some of these things, because I wouldn't take it anywhere near as seriously if it hadn't been for the writings of John Keel, that's for sure.
He was amazing, just amazing, way ahead of his time, still ahead of his time. Nobody's touching his stuff.
Absolutely. I think, do you find that it's interesting because he wrote something for, I think it was the Journal of Popular Culture, way back in like the early to mid 70s, called, I think it was Flying Saucer Culture. It was an article that then Keel would take around to conventions and sell a booklet of, which Doug Skinner did the amazing art on the front of. But he made a point in that writing in the 70s that he thought the new ufology had arrived. And later he was obviously bitterly disappointed because it was people like him and Verley and Brad Steiger and others that somehow we were getting beyond, the old trappings of, the government know all the secrets and, it's all extraterrestrial. But it seems like Keel's dream, he was even pessimistic about it by the 90s, but now it seems to really have imploded on itself. But I don't know if maybe out there when you're at Point Pleasant and the like, talking to people there, do you get a sense of Keel's ideas having like any penetrative or any effective worth today on changing people's minds regarding the way they look at UFOs or the way they look at Mothman or the way they look at the paranormal?
I think in the core of people that we've met along the way, I would say absolutely. I mean, you have an ardent group of Keel disciples who really think the world of what he's done and the way he really turned ufology on its ear. I mean, his ideas are borderline on occult phenomena, on all types of esotericism, and he doesn't totally discount the nuts and bolts theory, but pretty close. I mean, he describes them as being almost more energetic type things. And I love that transmogrification of energy. That's one of my favorite things to say. It just rolls off the tongue, but it's a fascinating concept.
No, it sure is. And I'm assuming you guys have probably met Steve Ward when you've been there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We know Steve well.
Yeah, Steve's great. He's been a guest on the show a number of times. He's obviously probably the most ardent Keelian, I think, in the field today. If there was a badge for most ardent Keelian, I think it would go on the shirt of Steve Ward. He's great.
Yeah, he's absolutely, he's funny. We met him 3.5 years ago,
sure,
on a second or third or maybe fourth trip to Point Pleasant, and
during COVID. Did we meet him during COVID? Yeah,
it was 19. I think it was 19, wasn't it, or 20?
During COVID.
In any event, we were going to leave town, but Jeff Wamsley convinced us to stick around because Seth Breedlove in Small Towns Monsters was going to be debuting, I think, the Mothman Legacy DVD at the museum the next day. So we stuck around. We spent another extra night. And as we approached the place, we were going to go talk to Seth, but I saw Steve, and Steve and I had been connected on Facebook for a couple of years. And I said, "Is that Steve Ward?" And he walked up, and before you knew it, we were friends. And he hung out with us and took us kind of under his wing. And he had a lot to do. I'd say he was kind of an inspiration to us doing the book that we wrote. He was.
Oh, fantastic. So what have you walked away from? I mean, your conclusions are in the book. People should buy the book and read it. Let me see. I'm sure I've got an image of it here. But what were your conclusions in the book, as far as what's your takeaway personally after doing all of this research?
So we didn't really go in depth about the methodology, and just for a quick overview for people who are interested, we applied a technique known as grounded theory. And grounded theory is a qualitative approach. Oh, thank you for the cover of the book. Grounded theory is a qualitative approach, which means we used conversational interviews to kind of tease out the perception and the experiences of the people that we interviewed. And we were really careful to not like put our own spin on things. But we used a systematic methodology, which is about as close as you can come to using statistics without using math. Because what it does is it helps you really get immersed in the data, take a look at the meaning of each statement, and then assign it with a value statement, what we call code. And as we went through the coding process, we started out with about 2,000 initial meaning units. We filtered those down into about 100 focus or categories, and then deduced that down to 16 dimensions of post-traumatic growth. Now, I was going to run out and grab a copy of the book so I could look at the chart, so I could tell you what those dimensions were. And honey, if you could talk for just a minute, I'll pull that up and I can tell you what every one of those was.
Okay, great.
Well, I can start talking about what the dimensions were, but then I'd have to fill in the gaps, right?
You go right ahead, and then I'll fill in the gaps.
Okay, so entrepreneurialism was one of them. Spiritual growth, personal development, I believe.
Perspective taking.
Perspective taking. You found it?
Nope, I'm spitballing with you.
Oh, okay. I was going to grab a book too to make sure that I had it available if it came up to this point, but I forgot to do that.
Is it the conclusions you wanted? Are they the ones you wanted?
271, Dean.
Yeah, okay, that's
271.
Yeah, 271. Oh, and it's in the circle. Gee,
Yes.
my eyesight's so bad I can't even read the circle. I was just flipping over to where I thought they were kind of listed. Like, is it appreciation for life?
Yes.
One of them? Community,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
entrepreneurial,
Yes.
family,
Yes.
gratitude, memorial, optimism, patience, perseverance, personal development, perspective taking, positive reflections, preparedness, and responsibility.
Yes.
When you were reading those off, and thank you for doing that. Patience. When you mentioned the word patience, I had a visual of Denny Bellamy during our interview talking about how people aren't patient about anything unless we see construction workers on the bridges. Because if we see construction workers on the bridges, we're going to sit tight. We're not going to complain. We're going to point out, hey, there's a little rust over there. You missed that. They're just so sensitive about that. I mean, why wouldn't they be,
Right.
having gone through that? Even though it was 56 years ago, it's still a very vivid memory that they go through. So yeah, patience is the one that popped into my head when you were reading those.
Well, they all used that bridge. They all traveled back and forth because they said that if Point Pleasant didn't have it, Gallipolis, Ohio did. So they would both sides would commute from Ohio to West Virginia and back. So for restaurants, food, shopping, whatever. So as children, they were traveling back and forth over that bridge.
Yeah, it was interesting that a number of your interviews had the respondents mentioned that something they had was fear of water or fear of being stuck on a bridge. Even if they weren't there themselves, they'd lost people in it, or it had impacted the town so much that they'd often be traveling across a bridge and they couldn't wait to get off it almost, or they'd be terrified about being stopped in traffic on a bridge. So,
yes.
Susan Sayer says still to this day that she's going across the bridge, it runs through her mind. How do I break out? How do I get out of the car? How do I break out the window if I go down? That was something she learned as a child, and that's something that stuck with her. She's scared to death. She says, I'll do it. I don't like it, but I know I have to. But she keeps it in the back of her mind that if it does go down, how do I get out?
Yeah, I think, you know what else I think your book is? I think it's a wonderful piece of oral history. Like, I'm very conscious because of some of the work I do that a lot of people from this period, of early ufology or I guess when ufology was hitting its straps, so anywhere from the 40s up to the 60s, we're losing people all the time. Like this book, in 20 years' time, let's be honest, this book wouldn't be able to be written.
No, we couldn't. There's absolutely no way. I noticed that Horace just made a comment that I wanted to speak to, and that was about Keel chronicling the bridge disaster the way that he did, and perhaps even though, I was old enough to remember the disaster being in the news, but without Keel, I doubt that the world would know about it. And I think he's right. Well, another thing, though, that I think I mentioned this somewhere, maybe in a conversation or an interview or what have you, is that because the Silver Bridge disaster happened when it did, I think that put an exclamation point on the entire Mothman flap. And I think it's one of the reasons that the Mothman went from being this strange anomaly and catapulted into legend, because now we have this disaster on the back end of those 13 months. And the two things, whether they're related or not, they're going to be forever intertwined in legend, no question about it. But we do remember both phenomena specifically because of their relationship to one another.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think much of just our experience in general life. If somebody, that's another point in the book. If you lose somebody around Christmas, your Christmas is never the same for you. If you
Right.
lose so you can join the memory of the holiday along with the memory of the life of the person. So I think again, as you just said, whether I'm even right in my suspicions regarding there being some connection, culturally there's a connection, and mythologically there's a connection. So I think now there's always going to be that connection.
I think there has to be. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Mhm.
And maybe just before we go, because it's something else I was interested in, you talk about the kind of almost the co-creation of reality between people. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because that's just such a fascinating idea.
It really is. I'm trying to think what was the word that I used to describe that, because it'll come to me as I'm talking out loud, but basically it's the idea that between individuals, we construct our realities. So when Jackie and I are talking about a subject, I know that the two of us having a conversation about some phenomenon, this could be anything. It doesn't have to be paranormal. It could be the water bill, whatever it might be. It becomes more real to us because of the input that we both bring to the table. And so it brings intersubjectivity. That's the word, intersubjectivity. So human experience is always subjective, right? But intersubjectivity is that co-creation between two or more parties, where we co-create our experience of reality and essentially round it out and make it more real, because now it's not just mine, it's not just Jackie's, it's not just Dean's, it's ours. It's our story. It's our reality.
And I think as much as that applies to just normal life, it particularly applies when we start to venture into the realm of the anomalous or the paranormal, where subjectivity plays even, I think, a heavier hand there than in our daily existence.
Yes.
Well, you were both wonderful guests. Before I ask you to let our audience know where they can get your book and see what you're up to, is there anything else you wanted to add to the conversation? Because this has been just a fascinating one.
Well, first off, I'd just like to say I can't believe how fast this hour has gone. This has been really, really fun, Dean. Thank you so much. It's been an excellent conversation, and thank you for talking to us as you have. It's been
My
wonderful.
pleasure.
What do you think, Mrs.
I can't imagine what else to add, because there is so much to talk about when you start talking about Mothman, the Silver Bridge, Keel, all of that. So without going on a really long tangent into something else, I would say no.
That's always the problem.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I guess I would like to kind of close with is that we have a deep respect and admiration for the people of Point Pleasant, the people who we had a chance to interview, the ones who we've met that we've not interviewed but become friends with. It is just such a warm, welcoming, hospitable community. We just absolutely love visiting there. They're tremendous, and their stories, we feel honored to be able to be a part of the study with them. It was just a phenomenal experience.
Well, it's a phenomenal book. I'm so glad that you guys wrote it. And again, I'll just flash it up on the screen for our viewers on Facebook and on YouTube video. It's Bridging the Tragedy by Bill Kousoulas and Jaci and Kousoulas, who were my guests tonight. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Where do people get your book, and where do they see what you're up to?
Amazon. It's available on Amazon, and we have a Facebook page currently, Phenomenology Research Professionals, and we try to post on there what's going on. We haven't really done a great job of like our next project or anything like that on that page. We are in the process of transitioning into a new website, which when that is available, it will be called PRP Connect. So make it simpler for people than to try to remember Phenomenology Research Professionals.
No, it's a great title, though. I mean, it's a great name for your group. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on. I really appreciate having you. And until I get to talk to you both again, and until I get to talk to everybody else out there, keep it weird.
Thank you.